But joining us tonight is author and journalist Randi Minetor. Minetor. I'm sorry, Randi.
Minotaur is correct.
Minotaur. Oh, I got it right. Okay, thank you, Randi. A working writer for more than 40 years, who has written more than 90 published nonfiction books, ranging from histories and travel guides to reference books. Along with her husband, Nick, the Minotaurs have worked together on more than 30 books to date, crisscrossing the country regularly to research and shoot photos for their books on birds, hiking, history, and America's national parks. Some of their books include comprehensive bird finding guides, Birding New England and Birding Florida, and their best easy bird guides to Acadia National Park and Cape Cod. The Minotaurs have collaborated on 10 hiking guides throughout New York State, including 2 editions of the best-selling Hiking Waterfalls in New York, which I highly recommend if you're visiting upstate New York and love waterfalls, which I do, and we spend our summers in upstate New York. Randi has also written 7 fascinating nonfiction books in the Death in the Park series about people who visit national and major parks and become victims of fatal accidents, hubris, or sheer bad luck. I think Randi corrected me and said that's now 8 books. Randi lives in Rochester, New York, where she has participated in migratory and breeding bird research projects for the Nature Conservancy and the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas. Randi serves as the current president of the Rochester Birding Association. Tonight, Randi will regale us with some of the magical meanings and mythological backgrounds to our avian friends from her book, The Complete Language of Birds, a definitive and illustrated history. The book is a beautifully illustrated, complete and extensive guidebook to over 4,000 birds, offering insights into their physical traits and also delving into the rich tapestry of legends, folklore, and symbolic meaning attached to each species across various cultures. Now, please join me in welcoming Randi Minetor to tell us how birds created the world and other stories from the complete language of birds. Randi, when you are ready, you can now share your screen and begin. Please remember to keep yourself muted and your video screens turned off. Randi, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And I really appreciate that I am your speaker for your annual meeting. That's quite an honor. So I thank you for hosting me for this evening. Let me just make one tiny correction to what you said. It's 400 birds in this book, not 4,000. I would have loved to cover that many birds, but they limited me to 400. This particular publisher had a page count limit that I had to meet. So let's talk about the complete language of birds. Here we go. Okay. There. In the beginning, there was a goose. This goose, in fact, an Egyptian
Randi,
goose.
I'm sorry, you're not sharing your screen? Oh, you are? I'm sorry.
It says I am.
I see it now. Randi, I apologize.
No problem. Okay, no, I'm glad you asked. So all right. This goose, an Egyptian goose, and at the time, the only being in the universe. Egyptians called this goose Gengenware, or the Great Honker. This goose carried and protected the egg that, when hatched, would produce all of life on Earth. But another being actually laid the egg. That would be Geb, god of Earth, also known by the nickname Great Cackler. Whether or not Geb was actually a goose himself is subject to interpretation, but when he evolved into human form over the centuries, he often wore an Egyptian goose or other bird as part of his headdress. Looking at this one right now, what do we got here? Like a lesser blackback gull, maybe? That's my guess. Egyptian's creation story has yet another. There we go. There he is. Has another character involved, Amun, Lord of the Thrones, who also liked to take the form of a goose, as you can see in this actual petroglyph from that period. In fact, the legend says that Amun's goose cry of victory over his adversaries became the very first sound people heard on Earth. And to commemorate this, Amun is known as the Great Shrieker. So Jeb laid the golden egg that contained the sun. Gengin Ware incubated and hatched the egg that brought all of the other beings into existence. And Amun's goose presence scared off all the early adversaries. So the result was, well, let there be light. So who knew a goose could be so powerful? Now, down at the southern tip of Africa, a whole other creation was going on. The indigenous Khoisan people tell the story of their creator, a god called Swigob, who ignited a great fire to bring all of the traits of the animals out of the ether and into reality. He gathered all of these traits and baked them into all kinds of animal shapes. Kind of gives a different meaning to Christmas cookies, doesn't it? And as he did this, a Cory bustard, a very large bird with broad wings, served as his helper. The Cory bustard fanned the flames continuously with its wings, keeping the fire burning until all of the animals were fully baked. And in a wonderful Aboriginal legend from Australia, all life began in the dark, skulking its way around the earth as best it could. The spirits of the sky spent part of an eternity deciding how they would bring light into the world. They built a huge pile of sticks that they planned to ignite, but they didn't want to frighten all of the beings on the ground by suddenly producing a big burst of light. Well, one day, an emu named Dinawan and a brolga named Bralach sat side by side on their nests, protecting their eggs in the dark. And as they talked about the children they would bring into the world soon, they began to argue about whose children would be stronger and whose would be more clever, much like any two pregnant women sitting around considering their future. So the discussion became more and more heated, and finally, Bralach grabbed one of Dinawan's eggs in her bill and used all of her fury to throw it as high as she could into the sky. And so high did it go that it collided with that huge pile of sticks collected by the spirits. The egg broke open, the yolk spilled over the sticks, and somehow that kindled them into a great bonfire. The sky lit up, bathed the earth in light, and showed everyone just how beautiful Australia was. And from that day forward, the spirits decided that they would build a great fire every morning to light up the earth and let it burn until evening. But they still worried that the transition to light every day would frighten the animals. So they searched for one animal who would call to everyone every morning before they lit the fire to let them know that the light was on its way soon. And what animal did they choose? Well, if you've ever birded in Australia, you know it's the laughing kookaburra, who was only too happy to volunteer to play this important role. And to this day, this devoted bird still wakes up the entire continent by calling just before sunrise. Now, after the birds helped get the world up and running, they continued to play pivotal roles in the early days on Earth. One of the big surprises for me in my research for this book was the sheer number of cultures around the world that record a great flood in their origin stories. We all know the story of Noah and the Ark, of course, and that as the waters began to recede once the 40-day flood finally stopped, Noah released first a raven and then a dove to see which one would find land. The raven never came back, suggesting perhaps that it found some nice waterlogged carrion to munch on and forgot all about Noah and his ark. But the dove felt more of a duty to Noah for saving her life. So she brought back an olive leaf, and this meant that the land had begun to emerge from the water. Well, other cultures tell the story a little differently. In some areas of the United States, Christians associate the painted bunting with the rainbow that God sent to Noah as a sign of his covenant with the earth. Painted buntings are the living embodiment of the rainbow, reminding us that God protects us and will not destroy his creation again. Now, in the Biracek area of Turkey, people believe that Noah released a northern bald ibis from the ark, a bird they see as a symbol of fertility to guide the repopulation of the earth. And the Athabascans of Alaska believe that the Great Flood came to an end with the help of the American bittern. The bittern swallowed enormous amounts of water, flew to where the water would do the most good, and regurgitated this water to form new rivers, like these braided rivers that you see all over Alaska. Now, an Ojibwa legend tells us that long ago the Creator sent a great flood to purify the world and drown everything evil, much the way we know it. One man, however, Wayne Abuju, worked quickly and built himself a raft and managed to keep himself and just a few animals afloat for an entire month as they waited for the water to recede. But the water didn't go down. So he summoned several different birds to dive to the bottom and retrieve some dirt from the old world, which he would then use to restart the continent. Well, the loon was a logical savior, of course, but he tried, and inexplicably, he failed. Then the dove volunteered, and well, as you can imagine, that didn't go so well, and the poor thing nearly drowned. So finally, a lone coot took on the challenge, but he didn't tell anyone what he intended. So time passed before the other birds even noticed he was gone, and he started to search for him. They found him floating behind the raft, unconscious, but still breathing. And sure enough, when they started to resuscitate him, they found a little bit of mud from the bottom of the floodwater stuck to his bill. The coot had saved them, and Waynabuju could restart the continent. It's worth noting that many other Native American legends of the Great Flood tell the same story, but with a different bird as the hero. In the Algonquin culture, for example, it's a merganser who brings up that morsel of earth using its strong feet to push off from the raft and drive itself down, and then that sharp red bill to gather up a little bit of earth and come right back up. Now, according to a Maori legend from New Zealand, the god Tawaki, who makes lightning and thunder, caused the flood when he created the crystal floor of heaven. The crystal floor caused all of the water in the sky to come together and fall on Fiordland, where the Fiordland penguins live. So this area receives some of the most torrential rain in New Zealand, so the Fiordland penguins have been credited with actually making the rain fall and even assisting Tawaki in creating this great flood. And in the jungles of Panama, the Great Flood serves as an origin story for the Great Tinamu. It seems that after the flood covered the world in water, the sun returned and a rainbow appeared. And the Great Tinamu, this dun-colored bird that blends right in with the surrounding foliage, saw the rainbow, and the intense color just freaked the bird out. It flew away from all of the other animals and retreated into the murkiest part of the forest, where it lives to this day, shunning color in favor of darkness. So these are just a few of the flood-related stories I found where birds played a starring role, but these amazing birds have many more lessons to teach us throughout the world's folklore and mythology. So before I started work on the complete language of birds, I had never really thought much about what birds must have represented to ancient civilizations. We take so much knowledge for granted now, but there was once a time when people knew very little science about birds' habits and behaviors. So when these people looked at the world around them and all the things they couldn't explain, they filled in some of the gaps with birds and their amazing abilities. So here's one of my favorites. Before science understood what we do now about migration and how it happened, it seemed to many observers that the birds just vanished in the fall and reappeared somehow in the spring from wherever they had hidden through the winter. So one of the most bizarre theories about this involves the barnacle goose, European species very like our Canada goose. And theorists back in the 500s AD saw barnacles along the wharves and the docks and on the bottoms of their boats, and they guessed that these geese transformed into barnacles for the winter, somehow sucking themselves down into these tiny things and adhering to surfaces to wait out the frigid weather. And in spring, the warmer weather gave them the cue they needed to change back and burst out of those little barnacles. Now, back in 350 BC, the learned Greek philosopher Aristotle, for God's sake, theorized that swallows, with their ability to dive so close to the surface of lakes and ponds to catch insects, actually dove to the bottom of the lakes in the fall and burrowed into the mud there to wait out the winter. The whole oxygen thing really just hadn't occurred to Aristotle at that point, or to any of the scientists that at that point called themselves philosophers. So this theory actually held on until the late 1700s, when sailors returning to Europe from warmer climates at the end of the winter reported seeing huge flocks of swallows in Africa, and somehow managed to put two and two together. Then in 1822, German villagers shot down a white stork. This specific stork that you're looking at, this is now taxidermied and in a German museum. This stork had a wooden spear piercing its neck, and the spear's unusual wood could only have come from Africa. So, in a flash of insight, the German hunters realized this bird must have migrated all the way to another continent and back. So, a single white stork finally changed the way ornithologists understood migration. That being said, so much of what people around the world attribute to birds has really nothing at all to do with science. Wondrous parrots like the imperial Amazon, the national bird of the Commonwealth of Dominica, and the African gray parrot, one of the most common parrots in Africa, are believed to have the ability to communicate with the spiritual realm. Not only can they fly high enough to reach the gods in the clouds, but they can actually form words. So you may need to watch what you say around one, or he may tattle to the ruling spirits, or worse, to your deceased relatives, and imagine what will be waiting for you when you get to the other side. Now, one of our favorite North American birds, the anhinga, and a bird I know you all know and love, has represented different things in different cultures. We know that the bird's classic stance, holding its wings out from its sides to dry after diving for a fish dinner. Some Christians see this as symbolic of the crucifix, making the anhinga a perpetual reminder of the passion of Christ, and therefore selfless, forgiving, and holy. On the other hand, the indigenous Tupi people of Brazil actually gave the anhinga its name, which means devil bird in their language. They determined that the anhinga is a trickster and a troublemaker, a conclusion they reached because the bird swims with its body submerged and only its head out of the water like a snake. Such a creature can't possibly be up to any good, so they think it's part of the devil. Now, here's one of my other favorites. Two categories of birds, magpies and mynas, that require us to be especially respectful when we see them, asking after their health and their family's welfare. If we treat them with disdain or ignore them altogether, we may meet a particular fate based on how many of the birds we see at one time. There's even a nursery rhyme to make this clear. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So whenever you see a myna or a magpie, be sure to greet it warmly. Good afternoon, sir or miss. How are you today? Is your family well? If you're with a group and you don't want to look like a lunatic, just smile and nod or bow slightly. I'm told the birds will understand. You had to see me last year about this time in Hawaii, because the common myna is essentially the starling of Hawaii. They are everywhere as an introduced species. And there I was, nodding and smiling to all of these mynas every time I saw one, just in case. Now, one of my favorite stories out of Greek mythology involves the common kingfisher, a gorgeous bright blue bird of the rivers and lakes of Europe, Southeast Asia, and part of the Asian continent, and obviously a relative of our own belted kingfisher. This is the tragic tale of Ceyx and Alcyone, two lovers in the days when Greek culture involved many gods living on Mount Olympus. Ceyx and Alcyone were soulmates, but equally important at the time, they were particularly well matched in physical beauty. This made the couple very popular with the gods, who observed their romance with great interest, much the way we watch The Bachelor. The pair married and they began a life together, and they were so happy that they gave each other little nicknames, as most married couples do. Unfortunately, they chose to call each other Zeus and Hera, the names of the two gods at the top of the Greek pantheon. Well, instead of flattering Zeus, this made him very angry because Zeus was kind of a jerk. So one day, when Ceyx boarded a ship to Ionia, Zeus kicked up a storm, and his wrath created a massive wave that swallowed up the ship. Ceyx drowned, and his body sank to the bottom of the sea. Well, Hera saw this, and she knew how devastated Alcyone would be if she never knew for certain what had happened to Ceyx. So as she watched the young woman wait and weep by the shore, Hera caused Ceyx's body to wash up near where Alcyone waited for word of him, and Alcyone, anguished by her loss, threw herself into the sea and drowned. Well, now Zeus felt bad for what he'd done, so he resurrected both of them from the dead, but he turned the two lovers into halcyon birds, naming them for Alcyone. Today we know them as common kingfishers, and every summer for 2 weeks the winds grow calm so kingfishers can nest on the beach and bring a brood into the world. We call these the halcyon days, a period of calm and happiness, and Alcyone remains part of the taxonomic name for several of the world's kingfishers. Now, have you ever wondered how goldfinches got their bright yellow color? Well, the Iroquois people did. They're the indigenous people up here where I live, and the story has been passed down now for generations. It seems that a fox chased a raccoon to make the little bandit its dinner. The raccoon ran up a tree, so the hungry fox waited all day at the bottom, but the raccoon's no fool. He didn't come down. So eventually the fox dozed off, and when he awoke, he found that the raccoon was gone, but before it left, it painted the fox's eyes shut with tree resin, and the resin had hardened, and he couldn't open his eyes, so the fox was essentially blind. The fox called and called and called for help, and some drab little finches in the neighborhood took pity on him, and they flew in and they pecked off the resin. Well, the fox thanked them for this good deed by using some yellow flowers nearby to color their plumage bright yellow, the color of sunshine. The goldfinches wear this plumage all spring and summer to this day, and I took a guess maybe it was Canada goldenrod, which is a native plant right up here in upstate New York. Now, the story of the trapped fox and the helpful bird is one of the tales that shows up in folklore of many different cultures, where it may be used to explain hummingbirds' iridescence or the bright color of a northern cardinal. We can imagine people of many different tribes coming together thousands of years ago in places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, or Wupatki in Arizona, or this place pictured here, now known as Aztec Ruins National Monument in New Mexico, all of which, by the way, are properties of the National Park Service. They would come together and trade goods and tell stories in kivas or in the shadow of ceremonial mounds, and one tribe might have an explanation for a thing that another tribe hasn't really thought about yet. So one story might get adopted by other cultures, and these would spread throughout the country. Now let's turn to some of the bravest and the most superstitious people on the planet, those who ply their trade at sea. Entire books have been written about the omens and portents brought on by pelagic birds over boats filled with sailors, fishermen, or explorers. Seafarers especially revere the albatross, any of the 22 species of these magnificent birds, including this Laysan albatross we were fortunate to see in Hawaii last year. Now, for centuries, having an albatross around your neck has been synonymous with carrying a weighty burden that we can't wait to dispose of as soon as possible. So this expression comes, of course, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I will not recite for you now. But in it, we learn that killing an albatross is the worst luck of all bad luck, inviting shipwreck and certain death. So how do we counteract this bad omen? The person who killed the bird has to wear it on a rope around his neck, literally carrying the burden of the misdeed. An albatross can weigh as much as 18 pounds, so this penance is really nothing to take lightly. But albatross lore on the high seas can govern the lives of sailors with endless speculation of whether an albatross following a ship is a good omen with a promise of the bird's protection, or a bad omen of an oncoming storm with the bird hiding behind the ship to avoid the worst of it. Whichever it turns out to be, there's another twist. The albatross most likely carries the soul of a sailor lost at sea. So whether it's good news or bad news, the bird's protection or its warning are all really meant with the best of intentions. So Coleridge's poem dominates seabird lore, so it may seem that albatrosses are the only birds that can affect a sailor's fortune. But the family of northern storm petrels also carry considerable weight with seafarers. The storm part of the name comes from their habit of taking refuge from an oncoming gale by following closely behind a ship, letting the large structure, and in the old days the sails, block the worst of the weather. Sailors took this as a dependable warning that a storm was on its way. But some thought that the birds actually brought the stormy weather with them, making a flock of storm petrels at a ship's stern a very worrisome sight. In fact, some seafarers went so far as to call it good luck if a storm petrel happened to defecate on them as it passed over them. Well, this is a good time to remind you all of the #1 rule of birding: never look up with your mouth open. So killing a storm petrel, even in retaliation for this defecation, was and is still considered bad luck, as if the shooter wishes to invite bad weather for a very long stay. So if you want to find yourself caught at sea in the middle of a hurricane, all you have to do is shoot down a storm petrel. And as long as we're on the subject of disgusting things that people do at sea, fishermen of old observed gray herons, the European equivalent of our great blue heron, standing patiently, waiting for fish to swim by at just the right distance, and they decided that something about the heron's feet must attract the fish. So they carried a heron's foot to improve their luck, and some actually coated their fishing lines with a noxious goo they made from heron's fat and feet. As this practice has faded, we can assume it was not very effective and maybe intolerably disgusting. So I also learned some fairly dark things about birds' lives, and I made a point of including these in the book as well, because my readers need to know that some of the world's birds face challenges from people with very selfish ends. The parrots of the Caribbean islands, for example, have been poached nearly to death for the black market on pet birds. Some of the islands have moved to name these birds as their national symbols, which releases funds and organized efforts to save them. But on some of these islands, it's virtually impossible to see the parrots that were once abundant there. You need special permission to go into wildlife refuges that have highly elevated levels of protection. And then we have the fate of the ortolan, a tiny bird that has had the bad luck of becoming a delicacy in parts of Europe. You may have seen an episode of Succession where they eat ortolan, or worse, an episode of American Dad where they eat an ortolan. The recipe is gruesome. They fatten the bird up in a cage for more than 3 weeks, and then they actually kill it by drowning it in Armagnac brandy. The chef then cooks it and serves it whole, and the gourmands who eat the ortolan pop it down in one bite. But first, they toss a napkin over their faces so they won't be seen stuffing their mouth with it. Only the beak remains on the plate when they're finished. I'm glad to report that the European Union has banned this practice, but there are still places in Europe where you can say ortolan and get one for dinner. Finally, let's talk about birds that don't exist. As we've seen, long before we began to understand birds in scientific terms, miraculous flying creatures became part of nearly every culture's mythology. And sometimes the powers of actual living birds just didn't rise to the level the gods and storytellers required. So birds needed to do something more, meld with the body of a god or goddess, become the lead character in a myth so vivid that it needs a supernatural species to tell it. In Egypt, the god Tot takes on the mantle of a bird, specifically an African sacred ibis, which, while he controls the passage of time and the change of seasons. Tot is the god of the moon, wisdom, writing, hieroglyphics, science, magic, and art, so he's a busy guy, and the ibis head allows him to change the pace of the passage of time so he can get all of these tasks done. This only works for Tot. Don't try it at home. On the flip side of this benevolence, a mythical bird called an uzlum provides an excuse for foolishness, shifting the blame for mistakes away from humans and onto a bird too silly to behave itself. In British and Australian legend, uzlum flies in a spiral of tighter and tighter circles until it eventually flies up its own butt. I'm guessing that everybody listening knows an uzlum or two in their lives, or someone who could use one. Now, here's the feng huang, or Chinese phoenix, one of China's 12 ornaments or ancient symbols that denote the power and authority of the person who wears them. The ornaments date back at least to 2294 BC, and perhaps much earlier than that. They're embroidered on the clothing of high-ranking people in Chinese society. So the description of this beast has changed quite a bit over the millennia, but this one follows more or less the more recent depictions. A golden pheasant's head, a mandarin duck's body, a peacock's tail, a crane's legs, and a parrot's bill. Wherever the feng huang appears, it implies the virtue and honesty of the people it adorns. It often appears at weddings as a blessing of fidelity and harmony, and some households bring it out to display in good times and hide it away when times turn tough. Now, exactly how and where we acquired the legend of the phoenix has been a subject of debate for thousands of years. It appears long before Greek mythology cemented the story that we know of an immortal bird who eventually tired of its cushy life in paradise. Phoenix traveled to the mortal world where things lived and died, but the bird knew that he would remain immortal. Well, one night, Phoenix built a nest of twigs, and as he waited for Apollo, the sun god, to arrive, pulling the sun across the sky with his chariot, he began to sing. Morning came, and Apollo passed over in his golden chariot, but the sun god so admired Phoenix's song that he actually stopped in midair to listen, and the sun stood still. As he enjoyed the song, a spark from the sun dropped down onto Phoenix's nest of twigs. The nest ignited, Phoenix burst into flames, dissolving into ashes. But all was not lost for Phoenix. 3 days later, the magical bird sprang up from the ashes, young and renewed. The bird realized he could do this again and again, but only once every 1,000 years. So he continues to repeat this cycle of death and rebirth as he will for eternity. So that's the complete language of birds, with stories about nearly 400 species of birds around the world. It's illustrated rather than photographic, so not full of my husband's wonderful photos, but it has vintage drawings by a wide range of artists. You may recognize, of course, John James Audubon work on the cover. Most of them are of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and this was an utterly delightful book to write, combining my love of birds, natural science, and history, and I hope it's as much fun for you to read as it was for me. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Randy. That was so great. That was so much fun hearing all of that. And it's funny, I used to be a psychotherapist and I worked in psychiatric hospitals and halcyon days. That was a great because one of the, as you know, one of the drugs is called halcyon and it's
Right.
commonly used in psychiatric hospitals. And that's exactly what it turned them into.
Yeah, I believe that. Well,
So that was
that's a
great.
good thing.
That's a great. So anyway, everyone, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat for Randy, and she will try to answer them. Addie Lima did say never look up with your mouth open. That's a good one. Uh, yes,
It's
and good advice to birders.
yeah, it absolutely is.
Yes. So while I'm waiting for other questions in the chat, I'm wondering. So what prompted you to write the book? I mean, what inspired you?
Well, this book actually came to me. An editor I'd worked with at a different publisher came to me with this assignment essentially when they were in kind of a bind. They'd had an author working on this book. This was actually the 13th book in a series of complete language of things. So it started with the complete language of flowers and herbs and dreams and all kinds of things, all written by the same author. She got to birds and she gave up. After spending 6 months trying to write this book, she just backed off and said it's too hard and gave up the contract. So then they were in a bind. This book was in their production run. You know, they had a time they needed it. And I am unfortunately well known for being able to turn things around quickly. So this editor called me and said, "Can you do it?" I said, "Of course." So I had 6 months to research and write this. Thank God, it was something that I loved doing. It was a wonderful experience learning all of these things. But yeah, it was whirlwind. So I wouldn't have thought of it myself, but I'm really glad to have had the experience.
6 months. That's amazing. I can't
Yeah,
believe you wrote this book in 6 months.
I can't either.
So, so,
Yeah.
so as you were writing it, what were some of the most kind of shocking revelations that you discovered?
Well, there were a lot of different kinds of things. There were things that were just, that were adorable to learn about birds. The number of birds that are now endangered or threatened or are so misunderstood in their native lands that people think that, little songbirds should be food, and things like that, there are an awful lot of those, unfortunately. And there are some wonderful people out there. Scott Wiedensaul comes to mind immediately, of going
Yeah.
out there and explaining to people that no, you should not be doing this. You should be using this for tourism and bring people to your country to see these wonderful things. The Also the effects of invasive species, the brown snakes in Guam that have wiped out almost every bird in Guam, things like that are, just terribly sad stories.
Yeah.
So a lot of things like that, and those were stories that I was able to bring to light in this book.
By the way, Scott Wiedensaul is a former speaker on our during for our series, and he was great. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
he is terrific.
for bringing him up. We have a question from Benji Stute. He asks, he says, "Thank you, Randy. Where did you find some of the source info for some of the stories about storm petrels following ships' sails?" He asked, "Ship logs?"
Oh, I wish ship logs. That would have been great. There are many books written about superstitions at sea, and I was able to come up with a couple of them, particularly some older ones that, God bless Google Books for scanning some of these orphaned books and, making them available to researchers like me. But there are many stories like that. I wish I could have gone through ship's logs. If I'd had years to work on this, I would have
Right,
done that.
right.
Yeah, but you had to take the express on a lot of this. But yeah, the stories about storm petrels, albatrosses, and some other seabirds, particularly the whole concept of them. Sailors' spirits, dead sailors' spirits, who don't survive a storm or piracy or whatever, inhabiting the albatross. That was a very interesting thing to think about of encountering these birds at sea and wondering which one has your former shipmate.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. It's amazing. So uh, the moment there's no other questions, I'm going to throw it out. And Mark Slifkin says, Randy, thank you. Interesting story. Sue Revy says, fantastic. Remember, Randy's also written many other books, both about birding in Florida and New York. And she's also written her series of books on deaths in national parks. So if you
Yeah.
have any other questions for Randy, you can ask. We have a little extra time, so you can ask those as well, because some of those stories are fascinating. Benji says, by the way, I know it's hard to narrow it down for all of us, but favorite bird and why?
Oh wow, I get asked this a lot, and it's very hard to say what my favorite bird is. It's usually the last one I got is the life bird, whatever it is. But I am very fond of cedar waxwings. I just get such joy seeing a little flock of those arrive in my yard or wherever I may be birding. 'Cause they're just beautiful birds. And I remember the first time I saw one, I was so excited that I was driving to work and I actually turned around and went home to tell my husband that I had just seen, I had just gotten my life cedar waxwing. So, uh, so yeah, they still, remain very, very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, that's so. I guess you might call that one of your spark birds or some. Or
Yeah, that
yeah,
my
yeah.
actual spark bird was something very basic, a house finch.
Oh,
I couldn't
that is
believe
very
that there were,
basic.
yeah, I couldn't believe there were pink birds in my at my feeder, and that just sucked me into birding. Like, well, what else is there that I've never heard of? And of course,
Right.
that opened up the whole world.
Right. By the way, after you mentioned that, as a bird that you really love, Dunel Garcia mentions American woodcock, love at first sight.
Yes,
Benji says, yes, waxwings, they look like a painting. I
yeah, that's
agree.
exactly it.
I agree. And Autumn Coyote says, Sirima, is that how you pronounce it?
It's a
Serie?
bird. It's a bird. We were talking about our favorite bird.
Ah,
Oh,
okay.
so it's a terror birds. They're terror birds. So that we have no more questions. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening. That was wonderful. That was a very different take on birds and how we view birds from a very different perspective. I know I've always enjoyed Native American mythology and myths, and some of those you brought in during your discussion. So it was a pleasure hearing that as well. Anyway,
Great.
Randy, thank you so much. Perhaps when I'm up in New York, who knows,
Right. Thank you. This was a pleasure. I really appreciate you having me here at your annual
Yeah,
meeting.
yeah.
And yeah, good luck and good birding.
Okay, thanks. Take care, Randy.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So it takes a great team to help bring these evenings to you. So thank you to all of them. And we can't wait to see you on September 2nd, 2025, on the first Tuesday of the month, which is, of course, the day after Labor Day, when we will be back after a summer hiatus with a whole new exciting lineup. So good night. Enjoy the summer. And as the song goes, see you in September. Anyway, with that, I'll say adieu. Good night, everybody. Take care.